the problems that require global action. You need global governance. And we quote McNamara, the former head of the World Bank, Jan Tinbergen, who won the first Nobel Prize in economics, who had no difficulty in saying we must have global government to bring internationally some of the same issues of management, regulation that well-managed countries nationally have got as part of their structure. So I haven't got any simple ways on how we get there politically, other than to say this is an idea, I believe, whose time either has come or ought to come. And it's no good leaving it to the political scientists and international relations experts, at least not from the ones that are mostly steeped in the American tradition. So I would love to see some Asian work on this issue. I'd love to see some, there were regional actions taken in 1998 and 99, I suppose 2000, to strengthen regionally the economic capacity. How many of those actions have a parallel internationally that we ought to move to in the next 5, 10, 20 years? I think Europe also has got some experiences there. And let us see intellectual work and not leave it to the discredited political scientists. Thank you, Louis. Wow, round of applause for that.
Another round of applause. Yes, thank you very much. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Roger Norman for his presentation on the human rights idea. So the floor is yours.
I will be cognizant of the time. I'm hearing doubtful murmurings, but in fact, I want to cut my presentation a little short and hopefully leave time for some discussion, and therefore maybe raise some provocative ideas, I hope, with human rights, because I think that there are a lot of provocative ideas that we can think about in the arena of human rights. And I will start with maybe one of the most basic, which is human rights by their nature are meant to be universal, not applying to Americans or Thai or Chinese, but inherent in every individual, every human being. This was the revolutionary idea behind the basic, I think, ideology of the United Nations. But I think we're all aware, we look at the news, we look at the headlines, that in fact human rights are contested very strongly, politically, geopolitically. There are many battles in the UN, at the Human Rights Council, over the meaning of human rights. Especially lately, people who've been working in human rights notice more and more confrontation. Why is that? And what does that mean about the notion of human rights and where we're going with human rights? I want to just put this as a basic question, which I will then look at a little bit as we go along and see if there are some ideas coming from all of you on that. I want to talk about 4 basic ideas I will touch on fairly quickly. The first is the time period we are in now, I believe, is a time of a fundamental shift in human rights. It's a very important time for human rights. And I'll talk a little more about what that means, but the basic idea is that the consensus around human rights has weakened a great deal, and the rise of, I will use China as an example, but it is not only China that is questioning the way human rights has been applied in recent decades, questioning whether this is an American or Eurocentric idea. Much stronger now, that idea, than ever before. And the rise of China and the shift of power, which we're talking about the economic power, the military power, this is obvious. Everyone can see this, and we hear a lot about what that may mean. But what we don't hear as much about is the importance of the ideological shift, a shift in ideas, human rights, and governance. Because I think that something that has happened in the past is those countries that are seen as powerful and strong, economically and militarily, it is often their systems of government, their governance, their ideas that are attractive, or that either they can impose or other countries move towards those ideas. Given the shift we see now, what does that mean for human rights? One idea. Another thing, then, I will go back to what really was the topic of my talk and is the topic of this book, but I will do it quite briefly, is a little bit on the historical background of human rights as they developed, looking particularly at the Universal Declaration and some of the treaties, and looking behind the idea of consensus into some of the political battles that have always existed in human rights that I feel are now very sharp and that require some addressing at the global level. And then finally, I will do what my colleague Louis did, which is to look to the future. What can we expect from human rights? And particularly, what will be, should be the role of Asia in human rights? Because I think it is very clear that this part of the world will have an increasing influence. And will it be to add substantive ideas towards the notion of human rights that may turn it into a more balanced idea? Or will it be more to undermine the current idea of human rights without an alternative necessarily? I think that's a situation that we're in. Let me start with a little bit of my idea of the balance sheet of human rights. Ah, yes, here we go. Much of this is history and diplomatic history, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. And only the last few pages is it what we were calling the balance sheet, the positives and the negatives. Let me start with something that I think is maybe so obvious as a positive that we take it for granted, like the air we breathe. And that is that prior to the establishment of the United Nations, the idea of human rights was essentially non-existent. It is, in its current form, as something that exists in international law, a very new phenomenon. And when you consider how new a phenomenon it is, it's a universal language. It's part of international affairs in a matter of decades, which when you look at global history, that's quite unusual. It is something that is, for better or for worse, and given the fact that implementation of human rights is very weak, but at its ideological level, the notion that all human beings should be treated equally, whatever country they come from, whatever religion they have, that there are certain rules that ought to be followed, even though we know they're not followed, they ought to be